He stood there, frozen, as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. The room was alive with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the muffled beats of a song that had been a favorite on the radio. But all of that faded into a distant hum when he saw her. She was there, swaying, smiling, a glass of wine in her hand, and her other arm lightly draped around the man who stood just a bit too close. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a company gathering where they all could unwind, relax, and bask in the successes of the past year. But what he saw in that moment was the farthest thing from a celebration. It was betrayal, raw and shameless, laid bare under the dimmed party lights. She hadn't seen him yet, she was too caught up, laughing at something the man whispered in her ear. She leaned in closer, her lips almost brushing his cheek, and they both smiled, intimately, knowingly. It was a smile he hadn't seen in months. His chest tightened, every muscle in his body begging him to storm over there, to grab her, to confront them both. But he just stood there, watching, heart hammering painfully against his ribs. It was only when she glanced up and their eyes met across the crowded room that her expression changed. The shock that flickered across her face, the way she quickly pulled her hand back, was all he needed to confirm what he had feared. She mouthed something, maybe his name, but he couldn't hear her. It was as if the world around them had slowed, leaving only a silent, suffocating space between them. She walked over, a nervous smile plastered on her face, trying to explain, but he had already heard enough. "It's not what it looks like," she began, but the words were hollow, forced, as if she herself didn't believe them. He wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to shake her and ask her why. How long had it been going on? Was this the first time, or had he been blind for weeks, months? He could feel his blood boiling, a bitter taste rising in his throat as he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The anger, the betrayal, it was suffocating him, and yet, there was something else, something darker brewing under the surface. What was he supposed to do now? Everyone around them was blissfully unaware, chatting, dancing, oblivious to the storm building in his chest. He took a step back, needing space, needing to breathe, and she followed, reaching for his arm. "Please, let me explain. It's not what you think." But how could it not be? He had seen it. He had seen the way they moved together, the way their bodies leaned into one another like two people who shared a secret. The way she looked at that man was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, a look that once belonged to him. "What am I supposed to think?" he spat, his voice low, barely controlled. "You're here, with him, and you expect me to believe there's nothing going on." He wanted her to deny it, wanted to believe that maybe he was wrong, that it was just his imagination. But she just stood there, silent, her eyes darting to the floor, and that silence was the loudest answer of all. Everything had seemed so perfect, hadn't it? They had a life together, a future they had carefully built over years of late-night talks, whispered promises, and shared dreams. He thought he knew her, thought he understood everything about her, but now it felt like he was staring at a stranger. A stranger who had deceived him, who had kept secrets, who was capable of smiling at another man like she had once smiled at him. He couldn't take it anymore. He turned to leave, needing to get out of there, to clear his head, but as he pushed through the crowd, he felt her hand grab his arm, harder this time. "Wait," she said, her voice more urgent, her eyes pleading. "I swear, it's not what you think." Then tell me," he snapped, spinning around to face her. "Tell me what the hell this is, because I can't stand here and pretend I don't see it." He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way her mouth trembled as she tried to find the right words. But nothing she could say would change what he had seen. Nothing could make him forget the way she had laughed, the way she had leaned into another man, as if he didn't exist. Then, almost as if fate had decided to twist the knife deeper, the man approached them, his eyes cool, his smile lazy, as if he hadn't just been caught crossing a line that should never have been crossed. "Hey, everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual, too casual, like he was trying to downplay the whole situation. It made his blood boil even more. "I think it's time we go," she said, looking from him to the man, as if trying to smooth over a situation that was already out of control. But it was too late for that. He looked at the man, then back at her. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a pain that he could no longer hide. She hesitated, and that was all he needed. She was trying to find the right answer, trying to find a way to tell him without admitting to it, but the truth was already there, staring him in the face. "It's not what it looks like," she said again, but her voice was weaker, less convincing. He's my boss." That was supposed to make it better. That was supposed to make him feel like he wasn't being played for a fool. The words rang hollow, echoing around his mind as he fought to keep himself from losing control. But as he stood there, staring at them both, something clicked. This wasn't just about a flirtation, about a dance that went a little too far. There was something else, something beneath the surface that she wasn't telling him. And then he heard it, the murmur of voices around them, the whispers that seemed to carry on the air. People were starting to notice, starting to turn and watch, and he could see the panic in her eyes as she realized that they were drawing attention. "Let's just go somewhere and talk, please," she begged, her voice shaking. "I can explain everything." But he didn't want explanations. He wanted the truth, and he wanted it now. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're going to tell me, right here, right now, what's really going on." And that's when it happened. The man, her boss, shifted, glancing around as if calculating his options, and then he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that sent chills down his spine. "She doesn't have to tell you anything," he said, his voice calm, almost mocking. "Because I will." He felt the world tilt on its axis, a cold dread settling in his gut as he watched the man reach into his pocket and pull out a piece of paper, unfolding it slowly. "There's a lot you don't know," the man said, looking him straight in the eye. "But maybe it's time you did." And as he stood there, watching, he realized that this wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was something much bigger, something that had been happening right under his nose, hidden behind the mask of a corporate smile and a string of well-rehearsed lies. As the man's words began to unravel the web of deceit, he knew there was no going back. But the question was, how deep did the betrayal run? And was he prepared to face the truth when it finally came crashing down around him? Welcome to the channel. Here, we stand firmly against any form of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they carry a powerful message. Infidelity can tear lives apart, leaving nothing but pain and regret. So, get ready, because you're about to hear a story that will shock you, a story that dives deep into the chaos and consequences of deceit. Prepare yourself for a gripping, unforgettable tale. Enjoy. Matthew Harris was a man who had built his life with careful precision. At 37, he was a dedicated project manager at a reputable tech company, known for his efficiency, his calm demeanor, and his ability to navigate complex challenges without losing his cool. Outside the office, he was the kind of man who valued routine and predictability. Every morning, he woke up at 6 a.m., jogged around the neighborhood, and picked up coffee from the small cafe down the street before heading to work. Life, as he saw it, was a series of small, deliberate steps leading to a stable future. He liked things neat, orderly, and, most importantly, reliable. That's why, when he first met Laura, he was instantly drawn to her. Laura Reynolds was everything he wasn't: spontaneous, lively, with a sparkle in her eyes that suggested a hunger for life and experiences. She had a laugh that could fill a room, a quick wit that could disarm anyone, and an infectious energy that made people around her feel like the world was full of possibilities. Working in the marketing department of the same company, she brought creativity to her projects, often throwing out ideas that seemed wild but somehow worked. She was the kind of person who believed that life should be lived to the fullest, every moment savored, every opportunity seized. Their meeting had been coincidental, a casual introduction at a company event. But from that moment on, Matthew felt his world shift. Laura's vibrancy contrasted with his structured existence, drawing him out of his routine in ways he never expected. What started as friendly coffee breaks soon turned into long conversations, shared dinners, and eventually, late-night talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning. It wasn't long before Matthew knew he was falling for her, hard. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe unpredictability wasn't so bad after all. They married 2 years later. The wedding was a modest affair, attended by close friends and family, but it was beautiful. As they exchanged vows, Matthew felt like he was on the brink of something truly great. Laura's hand in his felt warm and steady, her eyes glistened with emotion as she promised to be there, through thick and thin. It was a moment he would replay in his mind countless times, especially in the difficult times that would follow. For Matthew, Laura had become his anchor, his reminder that life could be more than schedules and plans. But as the years went on, the things that once drew them together began to shift. Laura's job in marketing had always been fast-paced, and her drive to excel led to longer hours at work. She would come home late, tired, sometimes frustrated. Matthew noticed how she seemed to carry more stress, her once carefree spirit dimming under the weight of professional demands. He tried to be there for her, to listen, to comfort her, but he could feel the distance growing. It wasn't sudden, it was subtle, a slow, creeping change that neither of them seemed to know how to address. Matthew, on the other hand, had earned a promotion at his own job, which brought with it a new set of challenges. He was spending more time at the office, often coming home after Laura had already fallen asleep. They still shared the same bed, but it felt like they were living in separate worlds. He missed her, missed the way she would light up a room, the way she used to make him feel like anything was possible. But when he tried to bring it up, she would brush it off, saying it was just a busy period, that things would get better once the project she was working on was over. The company where they both worked had been growing rapidly, and with that growth came pressure. Laura's role in marketing meant she was often in the spotlight, responsible for bringing in new clients and maintaining relationships with existing ones. It was a job she was good at, but it demanded her constant attention. Matthew was proud of her, proud of how hard she worked, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were drifting apart. He told himself it was just a phase, that they would find their way back to each other once things settled down. They always had before. The strain wasn't just professional, it seeped into their personal lives as well. They had always made it a point to have date nights, little pockets of time carved out just for the two of them. But those evenings had become rare, and when they did happen, they felt forced, as if they were both trying to recapture something that had slipped through their fingers. Conversation was strained, awkward pauses filling the spaces where there used to be laughter. It was as if they had forgotten how to be themselves around each other. Laura's friends would sometimes comment on how much she had changed, how she seemed quieter, more reserved. She would laugh it off, saying it was just work, but Matthew could see the truth. There were days when she would come home, and her eyes looked distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. He tried to reach out, to understand what was going on, but she would always find a way to deflect. "It's nothing," she would say, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Despite the growing distance, Matthew held on to hope. He started making more of an effort, leaving work early on Fridays to surprise her with takeout from her favorite restaurant or tickets to a show they had talked about seeing. He wanted to remind her of the things that had brought them together in the first place, to rekindle the spark that had once burned so brightly. And for a while, it seemed to work. Laura would smile, relax, and for a few precious moments, it felt like everything was back to normal. But those moments never lasted. Inevitably, the weight of whatever was on her mind would return, and she would retreat back into herself. It was as if there was a wall between them, one that Matthew didn't know how to break down. He started to question himself, wondering if he was the problem, if there was something he had done to push her away. It was a thought that gnawed at him, kept him up at night, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside him. The company's annual celebration was coming up, and Matthew saw it as a chance for them to reconnect. It was always a grand affair, held at a lavish venue with drinks, music, and speeches from the top executives. It was also a rare opportunity for him to see Laura in her element, surrounded by colleagues who admired her, to be reminded of the person she was outside of their strained marriage. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, the event would be a turning point, a chance for them to escape the pressures of their daily lives and just enjoy each other's company. As they got ready that evening, Matthew found himself watching her, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with. She looked stunning, her dress elegant, her makeup subtle yet perfect. But there was a hint of something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation that he couldn't quite place. He told himself he was imagining it, that he was overanalyzing things, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When they arrived at the venue, Matthew did his best to make her laugh, to draw her out of whatever thoughts were clouding her mind. And for a while, it seemed to work. They mingled with colleagues, shared drinks, and even danced a little. But as the night wore on, he noticed Laura's attention drifting, her gaze wandering across the room as if she was looking for someone. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, but he didn't want to spoil the evening, so he kept quiet, hoping that she would open up when she was ready. It wasn't until much later, after he had been pulled into a conversation with some colleagues, that he lost track of her. He searched the room, scanning the faces, trying to spot her, but she was nowhere to be seen. The music was loud, the lights dim, and for a moment, he felt a surge of panic. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she told him she was stepping away? And then, as he moved through the crowd, he saw her. Laura, standing off to the side, a glass of wine in hand, leaning in close to someone he recognized all too well. Her boss. Matthew couldn't shake the image of Laura with her boss. The way she had leaned in close, the way he had spoken to her, so intimately, as if they shared a secret. It gnawed at him, a dull ache in his chest that he tried to ignore as they drove home from the event. The car ride was silent, Laura's fingers nervously tapping against her thigh as she stared out the window. He wanted to ask her about it, but every time he opened his mouth, the words died on his tongue. It was as if he was afraid of the answer, afraid of confirming what his heart already suspected. Over the next few days, the memory of that moment played over and over in his mind. Laura seemed distant, distracted, and though she tried to act normal, there was a stiffness to her that hadn't been there before. She was still coming home late, her excuses thin, and Matthew could see the signs he had been trying to deny. He began to wonder if he had been fooling himself all along, pretending that things would get better when they were clearly falling apart. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, he finally gathered the courage to confront her. "Laura," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "what's going on? You've been so distant lately, and I need to know. Is there something you're not telling me?" For a moment, she looked at him, and he saw a flicker of something, guilt, fear, maybe even relief that he had asked. But then she smiled, that same forced smile she had been using to mask whatever was going on inside her. "It's just work, Matt," she said, her voice light, dismissive. "I've been under a lot of pressure with this new client, and it's been exhausting. I'm sorry if I've seemed distant. I don't mean to worry you." He wanted to believe her, wanted so badly to accept that it was just work, just stress, but the doubts lingered. He nodded, forcing a smile of his own, and they continued their meal in silence, the words left unspoken hanging heavily between them. But as the days passed, Matthew's unease only grew. He noticed her checking her phone more often, stepping out of the room to take calls, her voice hushed and urgent. And when he asked her who it was, she would say it was a colleague, someone from work, always from work. The final straw came one Thursday evening. Matthew had finished up early at the office and decided to surprise Laura by cooking dinner. He wanted to remind her of the simple things they used to enjoy together, to pull her back to him in some small way. He lit candles, set the table, and waited for her to come home. But as the hours passed, the food went cold, and the candles burned down to stubs. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, and every time he tried her phone, it went straight to voicemail. It was past midnight when he heard the sound of her keys at the door. She walked in, her hair slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged, and for a moment, she froze, seeing him sitting there at the dining table. "Matt, she began, but he didn't let her finish. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, though inside he felt like he was unraveling. "I've been trying to reach you all night." She hesitated, glancing down at the untouched plates on the table, and he saw her swallow hard. "I was at the office," she said, almost too quickly. "We had a last-minute meeting, and it ran late. I'm sorry, I should have called." He stared at her, searching for any sign that she was telling the truth. But all he saw was the way her eyes flickered, avoiding his, the way she bit her lip as if she was trying to keep something from slipping out. "You were at the office," he repeated, as if saying the words would somehow make them true. "And you didn't think to call?" "Not once." Laura's expression hardened, her shoulders straightening. "I said I'm sorry, Matt," she replied, her tone defensive. "I didn't realize I needed to report my every move to you." The argument that followed was unlike any they had ever had. It was raw, brutal, both of them lashing out with words they could never take back. Matthew accused her of being distant, of hiding things from him, and Laura shot back that he was suffocating her, that she needed space. But in the middle of it all, he saw the cracks in her facade, the way her voice trembled, the way her hands shook. And that's when he knew, there was more to this than just stress, more than just long hours at the office. Determined to find out the truth, Matthew did something he had never thought he would do. The next day, he left work early and drove to Laura's office, parking across the street where he could see the building entrance. He felt sick to his stomach, like he was betraying her trust, but he needed to know. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Hours passed, and he began to wonder if he was overreacting, if maybe he should just go home and forget this foolish plan. But then, just after 7, he saw her step out of the building, laughing, her arm linked with someone else's. Her boss. Matthew's heart sank, the air knocked out of his lungs. He watched as they walked to a car parked nearby, his hand resting on the small of her back as he opened the door for her. It was a gesture so intimate, so familiar, that it made Matthew's skin crawl. He felt like he was watching a scene from someone else's life, like this couldn't possibly be happening to him. But there it was, clear as day, and there was no denying it anymore. They drove off together, and Matthew followed, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt numb, his mind a storm of confusion, rage, and disbelief. Every moment he had spent trying to convince himself that things would get better, every attempt to mend the growing distance between them, had been a lie. She had been lying to him. They ended up at a small, upscale bar a few blocks away. Matthew parked down the street and watched as they went inside, his stomach twisting with every step they took. He didn't know what he was doing, what he was hoping to accomplish, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to see this through, no matter how much it hurt. The bar was dimly lit, cozy, a place meant for quiet conversations and stolen glances. Matthew found a spot near the back, where he could see them without being seen. They were sitting close, their heads bent together, sharing a drink. He watched as Laura laughed, her hand resting on her boss's arm, and it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Every time she leaned in, every time she touched him, it was like another piece of his world crumbled away. And then, as if to confirm the worst of his fears, he saw it, the way her boss reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his thumb lingering against her cheek, and then he kissed her. It wasn't just a quick, stolen kiss. It was slow, deliberate, and she didn't pull away. Matthew felt everything inside him shatter. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it all surged up at once, overwhelming him. He wanted to storm over there, to confront them, to demand an explanation, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer pain of it all. This was it. This was the truth he had been trying so hard not to see, laid out before him in the most brutal way possible. He didn't remember leaving the bar, didn't remember getting into his car and driving away. All he could see was that kiss, playing over and over again in his mind, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And as he drove through the darkened streets, he realized that everything he thought he knew about Laura, about their marriage, had been a lie. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that this betrayal was only the beginning. There was a darker truth hidden beneath the surface, one that would soon come to light, and when it did, it would change everything. Matthew didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over, as if trying to convince himself that it hadn't happened. But there was no escaping the truth. The image of Laura with her boss was burned into his mind, a constant, painful reminder of her betrayal. He had thought about confronting her as soon as she came home, but by the time she slipped quietly through the door, he didn't have the strength to face her. Not yet. Instead, he pretended to be asleep, listening as she moved through the darkened house, unaware that everything had changed. The next morning, Laura was already gone by the time Matthew woke up, leaving a note on the kitchen counter saying she had an early meeting. He stared at the note, the casual tone of it, and felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. How could she act like everything was normal? Like she hadn't shattered his world the night before. But he knew why. She didn't think he knew, and that gave him a strange sense of power, a twisted comfort in the midst of his pain. If she thought she could keep hiding, he would make sure she couldn't anymore. He took the day off from work, called his boss, and made some excuse about needing to handle a family matter. Then, he drove to Laura's office building, parking across the street just like he had the previous night. This time, though, he wasn't there to confirm his suspicions. He was there to understand them. To find out just how deep this betrayal went. As the hours passed, he watched people come and go, until he finally saw Laura's boss step out, heading down the street with a purposeful stride. Matthew hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, then he got out of the car and followed. He kept his distance, weaving through the crowds, his mind racing. Where was he going? Was this another rendezvous with Laura, or was there something else going on? It wasn't long before they reached a cafe, and Matthew watched as the man slipped inside, greeting another man who was already seated at a corner table. Matthew found a seat near the window, where he could see them without being seen. The two men exchanged a few words, then pulled out laptops, the conversation growing more intense. Matthew strained to hear, catching fragments that made his blood run cold, words like audit, cover-up, and embezzlement. His hands shook as he quickly grabbed his phone, recording a video of their conversation, zooming in on the papers spread out across the table. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. They weren't just talking about work, they were discussing how to hide money, how to manipulate accounts. It was clear now that whatever was going on between Laura and her boss, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was something much bigger, and Laura was somehow caught up in it. That night, Matthew waited for Laura to come home. He had thought about everything he would say, how he would confront her, but when she finally walked through the door, he felt his resolve waver. She smiled when she saw him, but it was strained, as if she was trying to hide how tired she was. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag on the floor. "How was your day?" Matthew's throat felt tight, the words struggling to come out. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, taking a step closer. But he stepped back, the distance between them suddenly feeling like a chasm. "Where were you last night?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Laura's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I told you, I was at the office, don't lie to me." Matthew's voice cracked, louder than he intended, and he saw Laura flinch. "I followed you, Laura. I saw you. I saw you with him." The color drained from her face, and she opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Matthew could see the panic in her eyes, the way she was scrambling to come up with an explanation, but he didn't give her the chance. How long? He demanded. How long has this been going on? Laura looked down, her lips trembling. It's not what you think, she whispered. It's complicated. Then explain it to me, Matthew said, his voice bitter, filled with a pain that was threatening to consume him. Tell me why you've been sneaking around behind my back, why you've been lying to me. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Laura took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. It started a few months ago. It was just flirting at first. I never meant for it to go this far. Matthew felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had suspected it, but hearing her admit it out loud was a different kind of pain. So, it did go that far, he said, his voice shaking. You cheated on me. Yes, Laura said, her voice cracking as the tears welled up in her eyes. But it wasn't supposed to mean anything. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me. Matthew laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Well, congratulations, Laura. You've done a fantastic job of that. I'm sorry, Matt, she said, her voice pleading, as if an apology could somehow undo the damage. I know I've made a mistake, but it's not what you think. He's been helping me. Helping you? Matthew repeated, incredulous. What, exactly, has he been helping you with? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's just been using you. Laura hesitated, wiping at her eyes. There's more to it. It's about work. I got involved in something I shouldn't have, and he said he would help me fix it. Matthew's heart skipped a beat. He remembered the conversation he had overheard at the cafe, the talk of embezzlement, of hiding money. What did you do, Laura? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't even know what I was getting into. He asked me to sign some documents, said it was just standard paperwork, but then I found out it was part of a scheme. They were funneling money, hiding it, and you're involved in fraud. Matthew couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected lies, infidelity, but this was something else entirely. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? I didn't know. Laura's voice rose, desperate. I swear, I didn't know what it was. By the time I figured it out, it was too late. He said if I went to anyone, if I tried to back out, he'd make sure I took the fall for everything. Matthew's mind was reeling. Everything she was saying, it was like a nightmare that kept getting worse. So you let him blackmail you? You thought sleeping with him would make it all go away? I was scared. Laura shouted, the words spilling out of her like a confession. I didn't know what else to do. He said he could protect me, that if I just did what he asked, no one would find out. I thought I was protecting us, Matt. I thought, protecting us? Matthew could hardly breathe, his head spinning. By cheating on me? By getting tangled up in illegal schemes? I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking, her hands clutching at his arm as if she could somehow keep him from slipping away. Please, you have to believe me. I love you, Matt. I never stopped loving you. Matthew pulled his arm free, his eyes cold and unyielding. I don't even know who you are anymore, he said, each word like a blade cutting through the space between them. You've lied to me, betrayed me, and now you're telling me you've dragged me into a mess that could ruin everything. I can fix it, Laura said, almost frantic. I just need time. I'll find a way to make this right. How, Laura? Matthew's voice was harsh, unforgiving. How are you going to make this right? Because I don't see a way out of this that doesn't end with you getting hurt. Laura didn't answer. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her cheeks, and for the first time, Matthew saw the full extent of her fear. He had spent so long trying to figure out what was wrong, why she had been acting so strange, and now he knew. But it didn't make him feel any better. It just made everything feel hopeless, like the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. The room was suffocating, the weight of their shared pain pressing down on them both. Matthew took a step back, needing space, needing air. "I need to think," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I can't do this right now." "Please don't leave," Laura said, her voice small, fragile. "I'm sorry, Matt. I'm so sorry." But Matthew had already turned away, walking out the door, his mind a storm of confusion and hurt. He didn't know what was going to happen next, didn't know how to fix what had been broken. But as he stepped into the night, one thing was clear: the truth was only just beginning to unravel, and whatever secrets Laura had been hiding, they were about to come crashing down. Matthew drove for hours that night, not knowing where he was going, just needing to escape the suffocating weight of it all. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the city lights blurred past. The air outside was cold, but inside the car, it felt stifling, like he couldn't breathe. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura's tear-streaked face, her desperate apologies echoing in his mind, mixing with the cold, hard truths she had finally confessed. It was as if everything he thought he knew, everything he had built his life around, was crumbling to pieces, and he was powerless to stop it. Eventually, he found himself parked on a quiet street, the engine idling as he stared blankly out the windshield. He didn't even know where he was, but it didn't matter. Nothing made sense anymore. He wanted to be angry, to rage against everything that had happened, but all he felt was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. How could she have let it get this far? How could she have lied, not just about the affair, but about everything else, about the mess she had gotten herself tangled up in? He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact. He thought about calling her, demanding more answers, but what was the point? She had already told him everything, or at least everything she was willing to admit. What more could she say that would make this right? He wanted to believe her, to hold on to some shred of hope that maybe they could find a way out of this, but deep down, he knew the damage was done. There was no going back to the way things were. As the hours dragged on, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Laura wasn't just guilty of betrayal, she was complicit in something much darker, something that could destroy both of their lives. And if he didn't do something, if he just stood by and let this play out, they could both end up paying the price. But what was he supposed to do? Turn her in? Expose everything and watch as their lives fell apart? The thought made him sick, but so did the idea of doing nothing. The next morning, Matthew was back at their apartment, his body exhausted but his mind still racing. He hadn't slept, and it showed. When Laura finally walked into the living room, she looked just as worn out, her eyes puffy and red from crying. She seemed surprised to see him there, as if she had expected him to leave and never come back. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at each other, the silence thick with everything they weren't saying. "I didn't know if you'd come back," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Matthew didn't respond at first, his eyes scanning her face, looking for any sign that this was all some terrible dream. But there was nothing, just the harsh, unforgiving light of day, revealing every flaw, every crack. "I had nowhere else to go," he said finally, and it was true. As much as he wanted to escape, to run away from the mess their lives had become, he couldn't. This was his reality now, and there was no running from it. They sat down, the room feeling impossibly small as they faced each other across the coffee table. Laura's hands trembled as she reached for his, but he pulled back, the hurt too raw, too fresh. "Matt, please, you have to understand." "I understand," he interrupted, his voice steady, but cold. "I understand that you lied to me, that you were willing to let this thing destroy everything we had because you were too scared to face the truth. I was trying to protect you," she said, her eyes welling up with tears again. "I didn't want you to get dragged into this." "And how did that work out for you?" Matthew snapped, the bitterness spilling over. "Because right now, it looks like we're both neck deep in this mess, and I have no idea how to get out of it." Laura's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked so small, so defeated, that Matthew almost felt sorry for her. But then he remembered the lies, the deception, and the sympathy vanished. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I thought if I could just fix it, if I could just make it go away, we could move on. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Matthew's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, a chaotic mix of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite place. He wanted to hate her, to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on him, but he couldn't. Despite everything, he still loved her, and that realization hurt more than anything else. "What are we supposed to do now, Laura?" he asked, his voice softer, but no less intense. "How do we fix this?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help, Matt. Please." Matthew felt his heart twist at the desperation in her voice, but he couldn't ignore the truth. "Help you with what?" he said, his tone sharp. "Help you cover up a crime? Because that's what you're asking me to do, isn't it?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you to help me make it right. I'm willing to go to the authorities, to come clean, but I'm scared. If I do this, I'll lose everything." "You already have," Matthew said, and the words seemed to hit her like a blow. She flinched, her eyes widening with shock, and for a moment, he thought she might break down completely. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath, steeling herself, and when she looked at him again, there was a resolve in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "I've already lost everything. But I can't keep living like this, hiding, lying. I need to face the consequences, whatever they are." Matthew's chest tightened, a part of him wanting to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But he knew better. This wasn't something he could fix with a few comforting words. It was a problem that required a solution, and for once, he didn't have one. "Do you understand what you're saying?" he asked. "If you go to the authorities, there's no going back. You could go to jail, Laura. This could ruin your career, your life." "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. I need to take responsibility for what I've done." Matthew didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her she was doing the right thing, that this was the first step towards redemption, but another part of him was screaming that it was all too late. He thought about the future they had once dreamed of, the life they had planned together, and it felt like he was mourning something that had died long before he realized it. "All right," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "If this is what you want, then I'll help you. But don't expect me to forgive you. Not yet." "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Laura said, her voice trembling. I need to know that I'm not alone in this." Matthew looked at her, seeing the woman he had once loved, the woman who had stood by him through so many ups and downs, and he felt his resolve waver. He wanted to believe that there was still something left to salvage, but he didn't know if he had the strength to find out. "We'll go to the authorities," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "But after that, I don't know what happens next." "Thank you," she whispered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "That's more than I deserve." As they sat there, facing a future that was uncertain and terrifying, Matthew felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't peace, not by a long shot, but it was a clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, and whatever happened next would change everything. But for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. And as they made their plan, the sun slowly setting outside the window, the shadows lengthening across the room, there was a sense that something was coming, something inevitable and final. The kind of truth that couldn't be hidden, no matter how hard they tried. The morning of Laura's confession to the authorities was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Matthew drove them to the district attorney's office, the streets a blur as the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on both of them. Neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. For Laura, it was the fear of losing everything, her freedom, her career, even the slim chance of rebuilding her marriage. For Matthew, it was the fear of watching everything collapse, knowing there was no way to save what they once had. As they approached the office, Laura's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had made this decision, and now she had to follow through. Matthew watched her, his own heart heavy, but there was no turning back now. They had come this far, and it was time to see it through. Inside, they were greeted by a stern-faced prosecutor who led them to a small, cold room. Laura's boss was already there, along with two other men in suits. Matthew recognized one of them as the man he had seen in the cafe, the one discussing the fraudulent schemes. The moment Laura stepped inside, her boss's eyes flicked to her, a flash of surprise quickly masked by his usual calm, calculated expression. But Matthew could see the tension, the way he clenched his jaw, like he was trying to keep control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. "Ms. Reynolds," the prosecutor said, gesturing for her to sit down. "I understand you have something to tell us." Laura took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "Yes. I'm here to confess my involvement in a scheme to funnel money from the company. It started months ago, and I was manipulated into signing documents without knowing the full extent of what was happening. But I need to take responsibility for my part in this." As she spoke, Matthew watched her boss carefully, noting the way his expression shifted, from surprise to something darker, fear. He had clearly not expected this. Laura's voice grew steadier as she continued, recounting everything she knew, every detail she had pieced together. She laid it all out, and as she did, Matthew felt a strange sense of relief. It was like watching a burden being lifted, even if it was too late to stop the damage. But then, the room changed. The air seemed to tighten as the prosecutor looked up from the papers on his desk, fixing his gaze on Laura's boss. "Is there anything you'd like to add, Mr. Wilson?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Or should we move forward with what we have?" For a moment, Mr. Wilson just stared, as if weighing his options, and then he did something that took everyone by surprise. He laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You really think she's the one who's going to take the fall for this?" he said, his eyes glinting with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "She's just a pawn. You want the real players? You'll need to dig a lot deeper." Matthew felt his stomach drop as Mr. Wilson continued, his words spilling out like a confession laced with venom. "You think this was just about skimming a little money off the top," he said, looking directly at Laura. "You have no idea how deep this goes. And now, you've dragged yourself right into the middle of it. You want to take responsibility? Fine. But don't think for a second that it will stop here." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for the men to take Mr. Wilson away, but not before he turned back to Laura one last time. "You should have kept quiet," he said, his voice low. "You think you're being noble, but you're just playing a losing hand." As Mr. Wilson was led out, Matthew could see the fear in Laura's eyes, the realization that she had just ignited something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She thought coming clean would be the end of it, but now it was clear that the stakes were much higher. She had expected consequences, but not the kind that involved deeper, darker forces at play within the company. The prosecutor turned to them, his face grave. "We'll need to investigate further," he said. "But Ms. Reynolds, your cooperation could be crucial in uncovering the full extent of this operation. If you're willing to testify, it might help your case." Laura nodded, though Matthew could see the conflict in her eyes. She had wanted to take responsibility, to try and atone for her mistakes, but she hadn't been prepared for this. Now, she was faced with a choice: either stand up and expose everything, risking everything she had left, or try to find some way to escape, knowing that the shadows of what she had been a part of would haunt her forever. That night, back at their apartment, the silence between them was suffocating. Matthew sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Laura stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, her face a mask of uncertainty. Finally, she turned to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Matt. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, you did the right thing," Matthew said, his voice steady but cold. "But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. You wanted to fix this, and now you have to see it through. No more lies, no more hiding." She looked at him, and for a moment, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been his everything. But there was no going back. Too much had been broken, too much had been lost. "I'm scared," she admitted, and there was a vulnerability in her voice that he hadn't heard in a long time. "What if I can't make this right?" Matthew stood up, his gaze unwavering. "Then you face the consequences," he said. "And you do it knowing that, for once, you didn't run away. That you tried to do the right thing, even when it was too late." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, as if accepting the weight of her own choices. Matthew felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of closure. He had wanted to save their marriage, to find a way to forgive her, but he knew now that it wasn't possible. The woman he had loved was still there, but she was buried under too many lies, too many betrayals, and no amount of regret could change that. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, interviews, and long, tense conversations with attorneys. Laura cooperated fully, providing everything she knew, and slowly, the full scope of the scandal began to emerge. It was bigger than anyone had imagined, a web of deceit and corruption that stretched far beyond the company. Mr. Wilson was arrested, along with several other high-ranking executives, and the media frenzy that followed was relentless. But as the case unfolded, it became clear that Laura's involvement, though serious, was not as central as it had initially seemed. Her willingness to testify, to expose the truth, played a significant role in dismantling the scheme, and it was this cooperation that ultimately spared her the worst of the consequences. She received a sentence of probation, community service, and a fine, but she avoided prison. It was a small mercy, one that came at the cost of everything else she had once valued. Matthew was there on the day of her final court appearance, but he didn't speak to her. He just watched, from a distance, as she stood before the judge, her head bowed, her voice steady as she accepted her fate. When it was over, she looked up, scanning the room until her eyes found his. For a moment, they just stared at each other, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving her to face the world she had chosen. In the end, Matthew decided to leave the city. There was nothing left for him there, nothing but memories of a life that had fallen apart. He took a job offer in another state, a chance to start fresh, to rebuild. As he packed up his things, he found an old photo of him and Laura, from when they had first started dating. They were smiling, carefree, oblivious to everything that would come. He almost threw it away, but then he hesitated, slipping it into a box instead. It was a reminder, not of what had been lost, but of what he had survived. And as for Laura, she was left to pick up the pieces of her own shattered life. She moved out of their apartment, leaving behind the place where so much had happened, and tried to find a way forward. It was a long, painful process, but she was determined to rebuild, even if it meant starting from scratch. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had found a kind of strength she hadn't known she possessed. But it was a strength that came at a cost, one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions on this intense journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, where we explore the real, raw emotions behind betrayal. And remember, we do not condone or support any form of infidelity. Our stories serve as a reminder of how deception can unravel lives.